no leader, my morning paper told me to be careful, so I missed the bus. That's the morning my bus crashes, Theodore a taxi into dust. If I had been a Sagittarius, this whole thing would have been hilarious. The Saturn was in the second house, and I guess it's not just working out. It's a thing, they do this for money. Those newspaper masters have no shame. No shame! Like to make their little pronouncements, but I'll still love you the same. Yeah, I'll keep loving you the same.
Two-Tone Miles here with a special episode of Scott in Biology, Pizza and Beer. Okay, class. Pencils down. It's time to have some fun. So for this episode, we got a few New York ska bands bringing you the East Side beat. It's coming in loud and clear out here on the West Coast. That song you just heard, that's Horoscopes by 4.0. And I really like the driving horns line in this song. And it's got great energy. Their music is available on iTunes, and you can hear some of their tracks for free at facebook.com/4.0band. So check them out. It's a good band. Now, because we got a New York theme here, I'm a huge fan of New York style pizza. I also don't live within 1,000 miles of New York. So to even get a decent slice of New York style pizza, I'm looking at driving more than 60 miles. So to this end, I've become a bit of a hobbyist pizza maker. And in doing so, I've learned a lot about yeast and bread making along the way. But you know what goes great with pizza? Beer. Pizza and beer. Two great tastes that taste even better together. But pizza and beer have more in common than meets the eye. Namely, yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. To put it simply, to make a dough, all you need is grain, water, and yeast. The same is true for beer, grain, water, and yeast. But in changing up how you produce the recipe, you get two very different results. Now, both recipes use yeast and basic metabolism to very different ends. Baker's yeast is used to produce gas to give the crust a good rise. Now, Brewer's yeast is kept deprived of oxygen, and by keeping it deprived of oxygen, it produces alcohol as a byproduct. Now, this episode, I'm going to share with you my pizza crust recipe and talk you through some basic fermentation and metabolism science. Consider this extra credit to the metabolism lectures. We'll talk the hard science a bit later, but mostly we're going to have some fun in this episode. Now keep in mind here, I'm basically turning my office into a bit of a kitchen, so if I make a holy mess of things, I blame all of you. I'm kidding, of course. I should also add that most of what I learned about pizza making is from Jeff Varasano's blog. And now, if you're really serious about making the best New York pizza possible, this is the place to check out. I mean, it's extremely comprehensive, and he's on a technical level well beyond my own. I mean, if you really want to know the whole science and art of pizza making beyond what you can get on All Recipes or Epicurious, you gotta check out Jeff Varasano's blog. Alright, let's get started here. So, in my bowl, I've already put in a tablespoon of olive oil. And I'm going to measure out half a cup of bread flour right now. Here's my half cup. Okay, so we got the half cup of bread flour. Time to add a quarter cup of beer. This beer is a Winter Humbug. It's produced by McTarnahan's out of Portland. Good beer. Also going to add a quarter cup of water. So, why do I add beer? Well, I thought the sourness from sourdough bread came from the alcohol, the ethanol. And I figured I could get good sourdough flavor by adding a bit of beer. I also thought I could use some of the yeast present in the beer. This is kind of kitchen voodoo. My science was wrong. The sourdough flavor, I I mean, the sourdough yeast, they do produce alcohol, but the actual sour flavor comes from another species called Lactobacillus. Now, when Lactobacillus burns sugar without air, which we call anaerobic respiration, and we'll cover that in the metabolism lectures, it produces a byproduct called lactic acid. And that's what turns the dough sour. The lactic acid gives it that sourdough taste. And believe it or not, your body also produces lactic acid when you do anaerobic activity. Pretty weird, huh? Okay, so the beer doesn't exactly give me the sour taste I'm looking for. Why do I use it? Well, it still tastes good. You ever had beer bread? Beer bread's good. So the beer stays. Alright, back to the crust. I'm going to mix that all together. Man, it smells good too. Yeah, get a good mix. Get it good and mixed. You're going to add in a little salt. Not too much. Now, too much salt, that's going to kill the yeast. And then you don't get a good rise on your bread. So, don't add too much salt. You can also add in a pinch of sugar to give your yeast some quick food. I do this on occasion, but I tend to coddle my yeasts. Really, the carbohydrates you're going to get from the flour, adding that sugar is not going to give you that much of a benefit. That's more if you want a quick rise. I also add a little garlic powder. And a little Parmesan to taste. Again, get that good mixed in there. So I use bread flour because it gives me a better rising crust. But you can use all-purpose flour if that's all you have. You may ask, what's the difference? Well, primarily the difference is one of protein content, or more specifically, gluten content. All-purpose flour has a protein content of about 11%, while bread flour has a protein content of about 15%. Bread flour has higher protein. Now, the wheat glutens help create a protein matrix that's going to trap the carbon dioxide that the yeast produces. So, more protein gives you a better rising dough. That's why bread flour is going to give you a better rise than all-purpose flour. Now, if you're really into it, you can add a little bit of a high gluten flour, and that's going to be about 35% gluten to give your dough some really, really good rise. But it gives the dough a bit of a burnt aftertaste. So that's something I personally have stopped doing. Talking about the glutens themselves, for most people, gluten is fine. It's just another plant protein. But if you have a gluten allergy or celiac disease, you have to eat a diet that's gluten-free or you're going to get sick. Now, if you're gluten intolerant, you're going to want to find a gluten-free flour. Everything we talk about in this, you can swap in a gluten-free flour. Now, it's probably not going to rise like a wheat flour, but if you add in an egg, you can bump up the protein content and get some extra lift. This is something I do all the time, even with my wheat crusts. It's probably not going to get the Jeff Varasano approval, but it is scientifically sound. The eggs give you a lot of protein, and that does help with the rise. So we're going to take a break here and let that dough settle up for a bit. So we're back, and I've been letting the dough sit for about a half hour before adding the yeast. And by letting the dough sit, you give the starches and the glutens time to align. And this process is called autolyzing the dough. I usually give it about a half hour It's entirely optional, but as I found out in the world of bread making, a little patience can go a long way, so I tend to do this step. So it's time to add our yeast. And I'm going to take a tablespoon of Fleischmann's yeast, get it mixed in here. Mix it. Okay, so what is the yeast doing? The yeast is alive. It's taking the carbohydrates you find in the flour and breaking them down for food. And as it does this in the presence of oxygen, it gives off carbon dioxide as a waste product. This is aerobic respiration since it uses oxygen. And we humans do this too. We breathe in air with our lungs and use it to drive metabolism, and then we breathe out carbon dioxide as a waste product. The yeast is going to trap small pockets of carbon dioxide in the dough, and that's what causes the dough to rise when you bake it. As you bake the dough, the carbon dioxide tries to escape, and it literally lifts the bread in the process. We call breads that use yeast for rise leaven breads, such as sandwich breads and pizza doughs. Breads which don't use yeast are called unleavened breads, such as matzah and tortillas. Now, in the case of beer, you're removing the oxygen during the process to force the yeast to go from aerobic respiration to anaerobic. So in the absence of oxygen, the yeast produces alcohol as a byproduct. Now, baker's yeast and brewer's yeast are still the same species, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, but they've been selected for different traits. A baker's yeast is designed for quick metabolism, to give you the most rise in the shortest amount of time, whereas a brewer's yeast is designed to live at a high alcohol concentration, which you find during your brewing process. It's still the same species, but quite a bit of diversity. So, unfortunately, the yeast, it's going to take a while to do its thing. So take a break here, grab yourself a tasty beverage, and we'll be back in a bit. Okay, we're back. And I just finished off a full shift, and looks like my yeast has been hard at work too here. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a lot of bubbles in there. And whisk it up, break some of those bubbles. You can see it compresses down into a much smaller volume. So that's kneading the dough. So, at this point, I'm going to add a half cup flour every half hour until basically I've put in 2 cups worth of flour. So every time you add flour, you're going to want to knead the dough thoroughly. So kneading gets rid of the big gas bubbles, and it keeps in the small ones. So why do you want to get rid of the big gas bubbles? Well, maybe you've had a pizza with, a nice big bubble right on the surface there. That's what happens if you don't knead the dough and get an even dispersal of those carbon dioxide bubbles. So be sure to properly knead your dough. Like I said earlier, you can mix in an egg to up the protein content if you want to get a better rise from your dough. As a side note, did you know that it's possible to use basically a water and flour mix to bait and capture wild yeasts? I mean, it's true. Michael Pollan, he did this in his book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, which is a really awesome book, by the way. You just put out a bowl of flour and water, and if you see something starting to bubble, congratulations, you've just trapped a wild yeast. So once you've got your yeast, you have to keep it living in the fridge. So every couple of weeks, you got to feed it by basically adding in a little extra flour, basically just constantly giving it that source of nutrition so that the yeast stays alive in your fridge. And this is basically what a sourdough starter is. You've got a wild yeast culture plus the Lactobacillus for the sour flavor. Now, I've tried to do this, but I've never been brave enough to eat my results. So, you know, try it at your own risk. In addition, the white film, apparently Kitty decides she wants to be in the episode. Hi, Kitty. Yeah, the white film that you see on the skin of grapes, that's wild yeasts. And that was basically how I was trying to get my own starter going, is that I would wash the grapes and then take the water that I was washing the grapes in and add flour in the hopes that I would wash the wild yeasts off of the grapes and into the flour and get my own starter that way. So, if you're having trouble following along, I know some of this I'm doing off screen. That's because I don't want to get dough all over my keyboard. Don't worry, we're going to put the full recipe up on the website.
Friday was pizza day, the best day of the week. All the kids would line up super early just to eat. Monday, hot dog, Tuesday, taco, Wednesday.
So at this point, we've got our dough. So we need to talk cheese and we need to talk sauce. Now, I don't make my own cheese. I buy it from the store. And if you want to know how to make cheese, you should check out Jeff Varasano's page. He'll tell you how. Something about cheese, though, is much like bread requires living yeast to make dough and beer. Cheese is dairy with active cultures. That's how you get cheese, is from the bacterial cultures that help make the cheese. Now, different types of cheeses are going to give you a different taste. If you find the high moisture, high quality mozzarellas, they're really tough to shred because they practically fall apart because there's so much water in them. But they have a really good kind of nutty flavor to it. That makes it suitable for a gourmet pizza. Now, the low moisture cheeses, they're a bit more solid. They'll grate a bit easier. So, like I said, they grate easier. Low-fat cheese, that'll give you a healthier pizza. But if you really want that greasy pizza parlor, go with a cheap, unhealthy cheese. Most pizza parlors do this anyways to keep their ingredient costs low. Now the sauce, that's pretty easy too. You can buy a pizza sauce in a bottle or a jar, but you can really just as easily make your own. All you need is a can of tomatoes, some sugar, which is going to take off some of that acidity from the tomato flavor, and some seasoning. Seasoning mostly in the form of a lot of garlic. So you take your canned tomatoes, you're going to want to wash them to get rid of that metallic taste. Then put them in a blender with a little sugar. Again, take some of that acid out of there. Add in just a little bit of salt. I use about a clove of garlic. You may want to use more or less depending on your tastes. And then your other seasonings. So just put it in the blender, blend it thoroughly. I mean, you're going to liquefy your ingredients. And at the end, you're going to end up with something that's going to be a bit watery. But what you do is you put it in a skillet, put it on low, you cook the water out slowly, and then you get a nice thick sauce. And this process is called reducing your sauce. So, bit of a side story here. Now, I worked with some of the folks who developed the OSU purple tomato variety, Indigo Rose, which is available at Johnny's Seeds. Now, the purple tomato, the skin contains anthocyanins, which are strong antioxidants. The same pigments are found in the skin of blueberries. Anyways, while working on this project, tomato, it's a really complex flavor. And we'd cross the two parents, and then we'd plan out all the offspring from the cross, and then we'd taste test the experimental lines. And the sheer flavor variety produced by crossing two tomato varieties was simply astonishing. I mean, there were a lot of tomatoes you take a bite and, you know, it just wasn't quite what you think of when you think of tomato. But amongst all that variety, there were some real gems too.
Hooray for pizza day! Hooray for pizza day! I miss pizza day! The best day of the week.
Alright, at this point we've got all our ingredients ready. We're ready to bake. Now, I do one pizza for 13 minutes at 450 degrees. That's one big pizza. But your cook time may vary. Just watch it as it bakes, and you should get the timing down just fine. You can try tossing the pizza, but if you rent a place like me, you may want to get your security deposit back someday. So I stick to pressing the dough by hand. Also, I'm a pretty clumsy guy, and I doubt I could ever get the hang of tossing. So, that's me.
Best day of the week, says Michael Jackson of Encino, California.
Alright. It's 14 hours later. Got my beer in hand. Let's have a look at the finished product. I made that. Looks pretty good. I'm gonna enjoy this. I'm gonna eat this. That's what happens next. So, each time I make pizza, the flavor always turns out just a little bit different. I'm constantly tweaking the formula, trying out things I like, trying to ditch the things I don't. And yeah, it's really enjoyable. I like making breads and pizzas as a hobby, and I think the science behind it is really interesting. So hopefully you learned something. If not, you got a free pizza recipe out of it, and you learned not to convert your office space into a kitchen. So yeah, and I hope you've enjoyed the music. I know I have, and so playing me out is a track from Across the Aisle. This band is featured fairly regularly on the Duff Guide to Ska. That's where I first heard about them. And I think the lead vocalist has just an absolutely incredible voice. Beer Song is a collaboration they did with Cooley Ranks. And some of you may know Cooley from the Toasters or the Pilfers. And if you want to hear them on this track, you're going to have to go check it out at atamusic.com. You know what? While you're there, buy the song. It's only a buck, and you'd be helping out an awesome band. I'm Two Tone Miles, signing off for Ska and Biology.